So I'm going to be a little rushed. What I have decided is that even though I'm left with less than half the time that I was allotted, I'm still going to touch both the topics. But feel free if you want me to stick with one or you want me to move on to the second. So I leave it to you. You can seek clarification whenever you want, and we'll like it to be a little more interactive. Okay, so here I am, I'm beginning, and let's start with these 4 questions. Do human rights matter in development? Should human rights normative framework inform our development vision? And a quick answer to that would be yes, why not? If it has something to contribute, why shouldn't it be the normative basis for public policy? The second question is the rights discourse a means to address institutional weaknesses, create accountability? Now, why do I raise that question? But when you come out of a developed country context into a developing one, you find that the process of social transformation is not often running smoothly as it is conceived to. And one invariably comes across issues related to corruption, leakages of public funds, the accountability of the public machinery. So is in that context, in the developing country context, does the rights discourse have something to offer? And taking that argument further, are human rights useful in the conduct of development process? That is, for example, good governance. So we will try addressing these 3-4 questions very quickly. And ultimately, I want to kind of conclude, yes, human rights matter in terms of setting up normative benchmarks, and they are also instrumentally useful in making the policy articulation and implementation process more effective. So they are relevant in our policy making space. Now, invariably growth is important, especially in the developing country context. But that growth becomes more relevant if it is yielding the right kinds of development outcomes. How do you ensure development is like taking a long journey for a developing country and making sure that you don't stray away from the track that you have chosen. So you need periodic milestones, just as you are taking a long journey along the coastal road, the beautiful coastal road in Australia. You need to be sure that you are not lost somewhere in the outback. You need to keep referring to the milestones that come every now and then, which reassures you are on the right track. So much in the same manner, development process, even when it is just focusing on growth. And what is growth? Growth is about creating more opportunities for the people and making their living standards, making improvement in their living standards. But while we are on that track of creating opportunities, we have to ensure that in the process of moving towards our destination, we are not letting some people slip off, or just ensure that the whole process is inclusive and the outcomes are being enjoyed by everybody. And I would like to argue that human rights could be those lovely milestones which you see on the roadside, which can keep the process on track. And how do we do that? So that's a complicated exercise. Those of you who are with law background or are studying law would realize that, law is basically a narrative. A narrative which has to be interpreted in different contexts. The context changes over time, so the interpretation could also vary and evolve. That is what is jurisprudence all about. But when you want to use that equipment in guiding the development process, you need to find some other tools. And I'll come to that in a minute. Okay, so growth is important, but so are the outcomes and the process of realizing those outcomes. Now, if you have a society like India's, what is unique about our society? There are many good things, but there are also certain not so good things about us. And let me just mention a few. Even though we have been a nation now for, 75 years, 70, 75 years? But we are a fairly segmented society. There is segmentation on grounds of caste. Have you heard of caste? So but this segmentation is getting diffused day by day. But yet it continues to be fairly strong in the rural, backward areas of the country. So there is segmentation on grounds of caste, and it's just an accident of history. I mean, I can get born in an upper caste or a low caste that ends up determining pretty much how my personal growth trajectory would turn out. So society continues to be fairly segmented, though the segmentation on grounds of caste is getting diffused as we move on. But there is segmentation on account of religion. India is perhaps one of those countries where every religion in the world is present. And you'll be surprised, I mean, though it's considered as a Hindu country or predominantly Hindu country, we had the earliest Christian settlers in our country. We had settlers coming from Persia, Zoroastrianism. I don't know whether you've heard of that religion. That also, so it's a melting pot of practically every religion that has been there in the country. And so there are followers, and there is segmentation on grounds of religion. On language, we have a plethora of languages in our country. And you'll be surprised, until a few years ago, if somebody from north, where I come from, went to south, it was not automatically seen as a person coming from the same country, because there's so much of a difference in terms of language, as I said, religion, racial features, religion, and what else? And there's a rural-urban divide as well. So the society is not cohesive, it is segmented. And when a society is segmented, it is also developing, vested interests get entrenched. So there's a basic scarcity in the country, and then there is segmented society. So there is jockeying for getting the power to rule, and those who come into the ruling state then develop their own vested interests, because that is what allows them to garner or harness most of the resources in the country. Now, let's take a digression. If you look at the global history, the world history, and you look at the last 100 years, there were 14 countries which managed to transform themselves over time, from developing status to developed. There are countries like, starting with Japan, and then on to South Korea, smaller countries, then some in Latin America. There was one feature of these 14 high-growth economies of last century, that they were rather centrally governed. They were not true democracies. Of course, over time, they have evolved and become democracies, functioning democracies. But look at Japan. It was, until the late 90s, ruled by one dominant political party. There was practically no other party. And it's only subsequently that opposition has started gaining kind of momentum and size. So, if there is a centralized policy-making process, let's say China, for instance, in the current context, it is much easier to break down these walls which are there in the social fabric of the society and which come in the way of creating efficient policies and their implementation. What I'm trying to say is, if there is a centralized government, it is very easy to knock off those vested interests which are perpetuating a certain kind of social order. But the critical factor there is that these centralized political entities have to be benevolent in their thinking. Only then they would be interested in creating a cohesive social fabric which becomes a desirable feature for quick and major transformational changes in the country. I give you an example of Singapore. up until 60, 70, when until much before any of you were born, Singapore was a very sad state. It was in a very sad state of affairs. It had all kinds of ethnic issues. It was basically a trading port. The level of livings were very low. It was dirty. It was, their rivers were so polluted that they were like effluent, full of effluent and whatnot. And there's a museum, incidentally, if you happen to go to Singapore, you should go and see that the museum which depicts the state in the 60s. But then what happened in Singapore? A very benevolent, a wise, foresighted leader, but an authoritarian leader. He took over. Lee Kuan Yew. He took over and he changed the society. And right now, if you look at any of these social indices, and of course economic indices, Singapore is right up there. Now, what has happened in the world since then, and this was also true of Japan, it was true of South Korea, Taiwan, you take any of these high growth economies that I mentioned, 14, that they had this advantage that a benevolent, foresighted, authoritarian regime decided that this would be good for my society, my people, and they started making the changes. But in today's world, take India's case for example. First of all, we are too big. We are a continent. For your information, we add to our population every year what you have in your country. Can you imagine? So we are adding an Australia to our population every year. That's the size of our country, and that's how fast it is growing. Now, in a country like this, as I said, we are a very segmented society. Now, if you want to make changes quickly and make it cohesive and make it develop faster, we don't have an option to have an authoritarian setup. First of all, the diversity and the segmentation itself will prevent that authoritarian regime to appear. And more importantly, the global dynamics is such now that it is not going to be easy for an authoritarian regime to come and start making, let's say, informed, benevolent, foresighted changes. Now, in this context, if India has to start making quick changes and transform itself rapidly, and I'll come to that in a while, the only thing that is left with us is we have to look for these scaffoldings, these other tools which can help us overcome these divisive, segmented hurdles which come in the way of our social transformation. And I would like to argue, since time is very limited, I don't know whether it was shared with you in that one pager that I had on this talk, mentioned 2 references. So if you have time, you'll find some of these thoughts elaborated there. One was a reference, which is a document paper published in the World Bank Legal Review. So have a look at that. That'll elaborate some of these concepts. And there was another reference I don't know, which is more about the next part of the topic. But coming back to the point I just want to finish it. So we don't have an option that some of these high growth economies had in the last century to quickly transform themselves, especially during the period from World War II to about 80s or even 90s. China is trying to transform itself, but it is a fairly authoritarian regime. Now, I would like to argue that in this context, especially in India and other such countries all over the world which are seeking to transform themselves, human rights offers that additional scaffolding. What is a scaffolding? When you're building a building, you put these scaffoldings around it, which helps the workers to climb and to keep building the building. So I would like to argue that human rights normative framework and the principles it provides could be that scaffolding which could help build this building of our nation quickly, much like some of these other developing countries in the last century. So let me go on. Then the question is, okay, if we accept that human rights can contribute to making a difference to the way a country is progressing, how do we go about it? Before I do that, let me also bring to your notice two other points which I wanted to mention. I want to touch about globalization. You know what globalization is. But the current phase of globalization is very unique. Guess why is it unique? First of all, do you know what globalization is? Cross-border relationships, whether they are economic, social, political, etc. And they were actually initiated through trade and capital flows. But one unique, and there have been phases of globalization in the global world history, several phases. There was one phase in the 15th and the 16th century. By the way, do you know which were the two largest drivers, the economic drivers of the global economy in the 15th century and the 16th century? Make a guess.
South America?
Sorry?
South America?
South America? No? No? Yeah?
British Empire.
Sorry?
British Empire.
No. Well, that was much later. I'm talking about 15th. British Empire was mostly 17th, 18th. Yeah, quickly. Yes. And the second one?
Russia?
No. You'll be surprised. The two biggest economies in 1500, which were guiding the process of globalization and dominating, were India and China. Between India and China, they accounted for more than 50% of the world economy. More than 50% of the world economy. Where are they now? India is about 2.5-3% of the world economy. China is about 13-14% of the world economy. But mind you, that cycle is going to repeat. I'm saying this not because I'm an Indian and I'm sitting here in a kind of a comfortable seat and speaking to a captive audience. But I'll show you why that cycle is going to repeat. And it's not very difficult to understand. So globalization has had different phases, but there's something very unique happening in the current globalization phase. And guess what it is? It is you people. What is so unique about you? You are so good at the social media. And for a change, the global cross-border connects are now at an individual basis. It was never so earlier. They were mediated through multinational corporations, through governments and states and so on. But unlike that, what is now? What is the big difference now? I can actually have a social exchange with this lady sitting in Australia without having to mediate through anybody. Why? Because of social media. Now, this has set in flow a very unique dynamics. What is that dynamics? And young people, they've started exchanging. I mean, I'm digressing a little bit, but let me just finish this thought. You heard about the Arab Spring? What was Arab Spring? There was an uprising in the Middle East which sought to change the regime in countries which were not thought of as capable of doing that. It started in a country like Tunisia, where I incidentally go quite frequently because I'm working with their government on policy reforms and institution building. In Tunisia, the first was the first on the Arab Spring radar, and it just happened because people got mobilized through social media, and what were they getting inspired by? They were getting inspired by the lifestyles, the well-being, the values which they saw were guiding the lives of people in the developed countries. So globalization in this current phase has created a dynamic where people want to have some common values to determine how they are governed. They want democracy, they want freedom, they want the right to vote, they want equality. Have you been reading what's happening in Saudi Arabia of late recently? You know, Saudi Arabia it's a major oil producer. Women couldn't drive cars. They couldn't step out of their house unescorted. And so on and so forth. You can't even imagine. Do a Google and see what is changing there. Why? Because people have got this access to information which is also helping them articulate their likes and dislikes and their demands, their values, which is forcing this social change. And let me tell you, when Arab Spring started, it started in Tunisia, a very repressed society. And perhaps Tunisia is the only country where the Arab Spring has been a success. There were other countries that followed: Egypt, Algeria to some extent, then somewhere else. It came to India. But India's the manifestation of Arab Spring in India was a major campaign against corruption. This happened in the period around 2010 to 2014. Corruption. Similarly, in Bangladesh, for example, the regimes were so repressive that they had selectively kept history of the country to serve their own ends. So young people like you in Bangladesh, they didn't know what, for example, happened when their country came into being in 1971. But social media, they started figuring out this information, not necessarily within their own country, but elsewhere in the world, and they became wiser of what happened in their struggle for independence, and how certain elements who were continuing to be a part of the society and at important positions were actually behind lot of killings and ethnic cleansing and repression during the time when that country came into existence. So what did they do? I happened to be in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, the state capital, at that time for some work, and I was staying in a hotel, and just 100 meters away from the hotel was the Dhaka University, a seat of learning, well known. And the roundabout near that university became the place where young people like you started getting mobilized. And what was their call? They said that we want justice for the country. We want those people who were actually guilty of the crimes during the struggle for independence taken to task. So they managed to convince the judiciary to reopen some of the cases. And some of these people who were identified as being party to crime against humanity within the country were taken to task. They were, capital punishment was awarded. So what I'm saying is, globalization in current phase is very unique, and this phase, Kamala, is creating a dynamic in the societies which is very different from earlier phase. And I would like to argue that in this dynamic, human rights have a role to play. Because what are human rights? Those who are studying law would be able to elaborate. I'm not a lawyer, by the way, I'm an economist. So my language of law is limited. Not so limited, because I worked on human rights during my engagement with the UN system. I was at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where one of the things I did, which I'll come to in a minute, is very interesting. I'll share that with you. But the point is that human rights are values which are civilizational. Every civilization, at some point of their time in time, would have subscribed to those values. And these are values which actually you and I and everybody, when we think, introspect, would say that yes, we stand for these. So you have now these values which have been embodied in various instruments, human rights instrument, treaties. There are civil and political right, convention on civil and political rights, and similarly there's a convention on economic, social and cultural rights, and several other thematic themes around human rights. So there's a ready-made body of values which the world at large say, yes, we like this, we want them to be followed. So I argue that if you have something which is already there, we should use that as the normative basis for policy making. Policy making is not value neutral. When I do something as a policy maker sitting in the finance ministry, I always have a goal in mind. That goal is defined on social considerations. It could be defined on subjective considerations of an individual, such as Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. He chose that I want to change my society. And since he had the power, he pushed it, and he was right, so he did it. But in a larger context such as India, in a larger country with more diversity, the social values have to be the milestones for policy making. And what better values than, let's say, the human rights values? But the challenge is, and this lady, you are from law, right? I can guess that. Why did I guess right? Because whenever I was talking about law, I could see her being more attentive. She was trying to make sure that this professor who is making a talk on, in going in an area where he's not an expert, is he saying the right things? Okay, so the point is, law anywhere in the world is a narrative. Okay, how do you make it law? You put some articles and then you put some sub-articles and provisions under that this is what is required. So there's an aspirational component in any law, and then there are these adjunct, I won't say adjunct, that's not the right term. These are supportive framework of rules and regulations and guidance which try to put that normative aspirational element of the law into practice. But all this is narrative. So the question is, how does a hard-boiled economist such as the gentleman who's sitting there, who's studying economics, or I would be convinced of using human rights in policy making? So you need to find a language of rights. And before I say that sentence, so law can be very prescriptive, legalistic, dense for a policymaker who maybe is not as intelligent as a lawyer. You need something more simpler to understand what is the implication of what has been put as the law, be it in the constitution or in other supportive frameworks. So policymakers want something more concrete. They don't want something prescriptive. They want the values to guide, but they want something very concrete, something very tangible, which can allow them to formulate policies. And what the work I did for UN Human Rights was to develop a language of rights based on indicators, quantitative and some qualitative indicators, which could translate those normative considerations into indicators, which then could be the benchmarks for making policies. And if that happens, then you are actually strengthening your policy making process normatively, and using indicators which are concrete, more tangible. You are putting it on a line, on a path which will see or has the likelihood of larger success. So I have digressed. I have gone to the next slide, but let me just sum up what I was trying to say. So the globalization that we are seeing today is very unique, and there is connect between individuals, and these individuals are talking to each other, and so they realize what is it that they want, especially in those countries which have been repressed in the past. Secondly, there's a huge economic transformation happening in the developing world. The developed world and the developing world, led by China, India, Indonesia, and some of the Latin American countries, Turkey in Europe, these countries are growing rapidly. And what are they doing? They're gradually shifting the balance from the developed to the developing world. So this shift of economic, in fact, there's a very interesting study, you should see it again on Google. There's an economist called, an LSE called, he was in Singapore in between, I'm forgetting his name, in a minute I'll get, Danny Quah. He has done a very interesting study. So what has he done? He has taken the satellite pictures of all the countries to get their nighttime sky pictures. So he's capturing the amount of light and electricity that is being used. He has looked at the traffic, internet traffic within countries and some such variables, and has developed a concept of center of economic gravity for the world. You know, some of you would know what is the center of gravity of objects. Do you know? Have you studied? You must have studied it in science in your school. For a body, animate or inanimate, to be stable, the center of gravity has to be stable. If the center of gravity, for example, if you have a vehicle which is very high, has a large clearance from the ground level, and you try driving it fast, and especially in the mountain, what happens? chances are you will overturn or go off the road in the mountains. Why? Because the center of gravity is shifting. So what do you find? The racing cars, etc., are all very low slung because the center of gravity of the racing cars, which have to be driven fast, is very close to the ground. So that's the reason why it becomes stable. So this gentleman, Danny Kwok, the LSE economist, was in Singapore. Now I think he's back in LSE. What did he do? He did this empiric study, and he found that in 60s and 70s, the center of gravity of the world economy was somewhere in between North Atlantic Ocean, somewhere between America and Europe. So in a sense, it's said, what it implies, that the dominance of Europe and North America determined which was the center of economic gravity of the world. But then he started doing this estimate every 10 years. And what does he find? From the North Atlantic Ocean, the center of gravity started shifting to the left, towards Europe. And somewhere in the late 90s, it was already close to where Turkey is. And then he started forecasting where this is going. He says by 2025, 30, this center of gravity would lie somewhere in between India and China, let's say somewhere close to Nepal. Why? Because now these two economies with huge population mass will build up momentum and will start dominating the world economy, much like the 15th century. So, I mean, it's just a kind of projection. And for the projection to become a reality, a lot of things have to happen. So I'll come to those things very briefly in the next few minutes. I believe you have to leave at 2, right? Yes. Okay, so we must give you about 10 minutes for questions. Are there questions in the floor? Yes? No? Yes? No? You have. I'd like you to hold them so that let me just finish things, unless there is something that requires clarification so far. No, okay, then hold on to your question. Now, why I asked this was I want to know how much time I should leave aside for the question answers. Anyway, we'll see in the next 10-15 minutes. Okay, so let's move on. So, in today's globalized world, both the process and the outcomes of that process are making it imperative that evidence-based policy making takes into account human rights concerns and standards in creating appropriate policy response. The one point which I forgot in the digression that I did. So globalization is unique now because it's people-to-people contact. The other thing about globalization is that in this phase, that it has created a huge amount of inequality. There's an Oxfam study which has come out recently, about a few months ago. You know what it finds? That top 1% of the world's population owns about 90% of the world's wealth. Top 8 individuals globally account for 50% of the world wealth. And these top 8 individuals, you can identify 5-6 of them yourself, right from Bill Gates to Buffett to Slims and to a few others. The worst thing is that in India, the inequality is even worse. In India, 1% of our top 1% accounts for 58% of the wealth as against 50 for the world. And 57 Indians account for 70% of the wealth. So globalization in current phase has created huge inequalities. And there are two kinds of inequalities that are worth thinking about. One is inequality in outcomes. So what are the outcomes? Outcomes could be income and wealth. And inequalities in opportunities. What are the opportunities? Access to good health, education, financial inclusion. You might find it strange, since you're coming from developed countries, that why is financial inclusion important? Because you would have born already with the sight of an ATM in your neighborhood, with credit cards, and etc. So you were in a society which is fully kind of engaged financially. But in developing world, even in India, about 55% of our population doesn't have access to banking facilities. It's a little less now. It was 55 about 10 years ago, so it's about perhaps 45. But it's a large chunk. And what does lack of access to financial system means? It takes away huge support which they could possibly utilize and use their own entrepreneurial abilities to make improvement in their lives. So you need to be more equal in terms of opportunities that you have for building your capabilities. Now the good thing is, in the West, while there are huge outcome inequalities, the developed countries, but the inequalities in opportunities are not so bad. And that's why everybody has a chance to do something worthwhile in their life. If you look at the developing countries, such as India, not only are the inequalities in outcomes, which is income and wealth, high, but inequalities in opportunities are also. If I'm not born in a good, let's say, a well-off household, I'm already foreclosing the option of getting good education. If I don't get good education, I cannot make it worthwhile in my life, and so on and so forth. So inequalities, and there's one book which has come out, and in fact it has also been criticized. Which book am I referring to? Which has made a lot of wave, which has made got a lot of attention in the world. There's a French economist called Piketty. Have you heard of Piketty? Do a Google on it. It's one book that you all must read. It's called Capital in the Age of something. One of you can do a Google now and check out what it is. That's the good thing about Google, and good thing for professors, absent-minded professors like me. So Piketty's book is about the rising inequality in the West and the South and the North and across countries. So globalization has had this consequence, and we need to address this consequence, and I would like to argue that human rights help us do that. Now the question is, all this is fine. How do we start using human rights in policy making? So one way is to create legal entitlements. And since I'm supposed to talk about India, what are legal entitlements? First of all, what is a right? A right means people in general have some claim on, let's say, a basket of goods and services, and somebody else is duty bound to provide that basket of goods and services. So there's a duty bearer and there's a claim holder. Invariably, the duty bearer is the state, individually or collectively. So there could be a right against a collective. What is a collective? A global community. For example, have you heard of the 7.7% of GDP parameter or target for the developed North to provide as aid to the developing South? Have you heard of this figure ever? So this is, in a sense, a collective claim on people who are really, say, some people who are facing famines, repeated famines in Ethiopia or elsewhere in Africa. They have a claim on the larger humanity, principally the well-off countries, to help them, since they don't even have enough to survive. So that claim is being met through the Overseas Development Assistance, ODA. And there are targets which the global community puts together. The point I'm trying to say is that one way of implementing human rights is to create legal entitlements. But the problem with this approach is, and for example, let me just put the entire slide. If you see at the bottom, I'm mentioning India has adopted a reasonably explicit, or had adopted a reasonably explicit approach to creating certain basic legal entitlement to certain services, which will help bridge the disparities in opportunities across people in the country. So what did they do? This happened between 2005 and 2010. As a part of our development strategy, we said, okay, first of all, there should be right to information in the public domain. So a citizen should know why the government is doing something, and any information which is related to that policy measure should be made public, so that if it infringes his own rights or his own well-being, he can actually raise his voice and get correctives. So India created a right to information in 2005. We created a right to education. We said that it is imperative on the part of the state to provide elementary education free of cost to every citizen. Then we created a right to work. Now this is not a right to any kind of work. You can't simply go and show up your face to the government and say, okay, I want to be a doctor, so give me the right to become a doctor. So it's not that. It's only at a very basic level. So in India, for example, we are still largely, a lot of our population is dependent on agriculture, and agriculture is a seasonal exercise. There are parts of months in a year when not enough work is available. So we have created a right to work so that such people, semi-skilled and unskilled, can go to a government functionary, assigned government functionary, and ask for 100 days of work at certain predetermined wage levels within 5 kilometers of their habitation. So this gives them a security. Okay, I don't have work on somebody else's farm or on some other place. I've been laid off. I can actually go and work for 100 days for a predetermined salary, and that will help me keep my body and soul together. Now you might find it funny. Why does a person need to go and get work for 100 days? Why is there no social security? So the fact remains, we don't have a social security system like in the West, simply because we can't afford one. We are a huge, huge population. Until unless we grow, create revenues for the government, we can't have a social security system such as the one you have in your country or elsewhere in the West. So we are trying to make do with these entitlement-based programs to provide some kind of social security to the real marginalized segments of the population. So besides right to work, as I described, we have right to food, and we have also right to health. Then we have certain social welfare measures which give a certain very bare minimum pensions to elderly beyond a certain age group, and also scholarships for education to certain segments of the population which have been typically been more marginalized in the society. So we've created entitlement. But the catch here is, where do you draw a line? Where do you say that no more entitlements? Why? Because entitlements have to be funded. And government doesn't want to breach its budgetary balance. Because if budgetary balance or fiscal deficit, I don't know whether you're familiar with these terms, if the budget is not balanced, it has consequences on the way economy behaves or goes forward. And we don't want to minimize our future opportunities just because we think today we need to create all these entitlements. So there has to be a rational way of going about creating entitlements. But we have done that. And there's another thing that we have done. We have done a huge, the biggest ever program of creating a basis for assigning identities to the individuals. We call it Aadhaar. Unique Identification Authority of India has created a biometric identification of every Indian. Now, you might find that, what's the big deal in doing this? There's a big deal. Why? Because if I want to access certain welfare measures from the government, and I go to the officer, the lady officer who is responsible to administer it, and I say, look, I'm from a poor family, etc., etc., I'm, as per your policy, entitled for this subsidy or this support, please give it to me. So she will say, how do I know you are who you are trying to portray? The identity is in question. She will say, how do I know you are Rajiv and you are not John? Because John is not in the group of people who can avail this subsidy. Rajiv is, but how do I know you are Rajiv? So we had this serious problem. And that actually also created a lot of scope for leakage, corruption, and so on and so forth. So we started with this program, and a private sector, we have a very big software company called Infosys. I don't know whether you've heard of it. The gentleman helped set up that company. And at 50, 55, he said he had minted his money. I want to do something for the country. So he devised this program and he actually executed it. And today, out of 1 billion people or 1.2 billion people, I think we have biometric identities for close to 95% of the population. The process is going on. And this is a game changer. Why? Because it allows, we can use it in multiple ways to ensure the corruption and leakages of public funds are minimized. But then this cannot be the way forward, because there is, after all, a limit to the available resources. So we have to find other ways of using maybe human rights normative and instrumental tools to make our society more efficient, less corruption free, and a means, and use them as a means to equalize, get away the segmentations on grounds of caste, etc., which have been manipulated by vested interest to retain their benefits in the society. But this cannot be the way for all kinds of policies that we want. So what I argue is that develop these human rights indicators, and I don't want to go into that. But how are human rights indicators different from the indicators we normally use in public policy? Well, they are different. First of all, because human rights are values that we all subscribe to, our governments have accepted. So I have talked of 3 kinds of indicators. I call them structural, process, and outcome. In other words, institutional indicators, effort indicators, and result indicators. Is a country, having subscribed to a particular human rights normative framework, creating the institutions to implement it? So that will reflect the intention, the commitment of the political parties, regimes. Once they have made a commitment and you can capture the institutional framework, is that institutional framework being put to good use? So there are efforts being made to translate that commitment into some milestones, and which over time can consolidate into outcomes which can be associated with the realization of human rights. It's a little, it would require time to go into it, but let me just give you one example to clarify this structure. India has a very progressive Supreme Court. The higher judiciary in India is very progressive. It is one of the, first of all, the Indian Constitution is a good one. Until South Africa formulated or enacted its constitution, Indian Constitution was considered as one of the more progressive constitutions in the world. Now it is South Africa. And we have all borrowed each other's, from each other. We have borrowed some of our constitutional provisions from what Britain did, what US did. Anyways, the point I was trying to make is that I lost my thought. What in a minute it will come back to me. The point I'm trying to say is, yes, I was trying to give an example to capture the structure I have proposed for making human rights indicators. So India's higher judiciary is very progressive. But there is a problem. The problem is that we have a huge backlog of cases. So yes, the intentions are there. We have created an independent institution, but the institution is not functioning at the level at which it could dispense justice quickly and in a timely manner. So the efforts are lacking. So you need something to straighten out those efforts. Perhaps you need to multiply the number of courts, judges, and so on and so forth. And the final issue is, are those efforts leading to the outcomes that are required? And there again, because there is delay of justice delayed is justice denied. So we need to capture a configuration of indicators in order to see how human rights are being implemented. And my argument is that you can create human rights entitlements in some areas, but in other areas, build the relevant human rights indicators and integrate them in your policies so that human rights can start influencing the way things are panning out. This is all about human rights. I've mentioned you what we are doing on human rights. So we have these 4, 5, 6 entitlement-based programs, but the rest we are gradually trying to as we grow, we raise revenues, we would also like to have a more effective social security floor, such as the one you have in the West. So that's about human rights. I have about 20 minutes. I'll just take you through. And incidentally, those who are interested in this work on human rights indicators, which is bridging the human rights discourse with the development discourse, there's a book which I wrote, and it is on web. It's available in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It's called A Guide to Measurement and Implementation. Human Rights Indicators, A Guide to Measurement and Implementation, available on UNOHCHR website. Anyways, let's go forward. I skip this. India's transformation, the second part of my talk. This would be more interesting for those who are with the development bent of mind. Okay, when we talk of a country's transformation, we basically talk of three transformations: economic transformation, political transformation, and social transformation. What is economic transformation all about? If you're starting at a very low base, it is about making sure that everybody's basic needs are met. Then people have productive livelihood opportunities. They don't want to live on charity. They want to be productively engaged, have dignity of work, etc. And they should face a reasonable improvement in their standard of living over time. And as a country, what is economic transformation about? It's about self-reliance and economically and ecologically sustainable process of development. So then there is a political transformation. Of course, it's about having a democratic polity. But then India is a democracy, is the largest functioning democracy in the world. And by the way, we are so good at conducting our elections because of the huge numbers that are involved that we are now actually helping even the developed countries in providing technical assistance for running their elections. I guess we didn't do that for the US the last time around, and the results are there for everybody to see. And I don't know about your country, but I'll leave that to you to figure out. So political transformation is not only about having functioning democracy, it's about real empowerment for every person. Rule of law and access to justice. I just mentioned in India, justice is invariably getting delayed because there's such a huge backlog of cases in the courts. Then it is about accountable, efficient and participatory democracy, and the nation should have a voice that it can protect, with which it can protect its interests at the global level. I mean, you may not like it when I say, but there's a huge politics at the global level. Just as there are vested interests in, say, in my country, at the global there are also vested interests, say, of the developed countries who want a certain regime to prevail because it protects their interests, and they're not they're not wrong in that sense. But then this has to change. Why it has to change? Because the economic balance of the world is also changing. So that's why there is a talk of those who are studying international affairs democratizing the Security Council in the UN. Why only 6 people should sit there as permanent members? So this is a fallout of the fact that vested interests at the global level also have to be challenged as the context of the world is changing. So that's a part of the political transformation. Then there's social transformation. Yes, we all value diversity in our society, but we also need societies that are cohesive, that can move quickly if there is a social agreement on where it needs to move. So we don't need segmented society. People should be equal, and they shouldn't be segmented just like in India on caste, religion, language, and so on and so forth. We need cohesive society. We need equality of outcome and not just equality of opportunities. So this is the kind of transformation that India is looking at. And where are we? I think the glass is only half full. We've been a nation for 75, 70 odd years, but in this journey, we have covered a lot of distance, but the glass is only half full. We are among the top 10 largest economies in the world, and if there's something called the purchasing power parity estimates that you must be familiar with, it kinds of, the PPP estimates take away the cost of living differences in societies. And so they give a more accurate measure of comparison between societies. So if you look at PPP estimates, we are the fourth largest economy after US, China, Japan, India. And between Japan and India, it depends on how fast we are growing in a year, we sometimes become third. But anyways, on US dollar terms, we are the 10th largest. Yet, we also have nearly 1/4 of our population not having access to resources enough to meet their basic needs. We have poverty. The incidence of poverty is about anything between 20 to 25%, which is a huge number. We also have about 40 to 45% of our children suffering from malnourishment. This is a sad state of affairs. Although we have become self-sufficient in our food, and we have a good amount of national food security, but we don't have food security at the level of households. So you still hear some starvation deaths happening here and there. You still hear some backward districts which are food scarce. So though our economy has grown and we were dependent on food aid for first 20 years of our existence, and had America not shared its food with us, we would have perhaps, right after independence, faced riots in our streets because there was not enough food being grown here. But we have gone past that. Today we are the largest exporters of rice in the world. We are the second biggest producers of dairy products. You'll be surprised, more than Australia. We are, I think, the second biggest producer of wheat, and so on and so forth. So we have come a long way, but there are problems still. As I said, we don't have food security at the level of households. Then, in terms of our society, we still continue to be segmented. There are issues that need to be addressed. Our politics, our democracy has one basic lacuna. The entry barriers to politics are very high. Somebody who's studying economics knows the importance of entry barriers. If you have entry barriers which are high, you don't have perfect competition. If you don't have perfect competition, who stands to lose out? Consumers, right? Because those who are monopolists will make a lot of profit, and they won't pass the consumer surplus to the surplus to the consumers. Now, when I say there are high entry barriers in India to politics, it means, for example, today I have done my work in life, and I think that I still have some energy left. I should join politics, but I can't, because in India, to join politics, you need either money or you need muscles. So you have to have money bags or muscle bags. Otherwise, you can't succeed in politics. So, although we are a functioning democracy, we have this challenge that you have to attract more talent to become active politicians, to help transform the country. Then I also want to mention that there are divisive tendencies still in the country on religious grounds, the Hindu and the Muslim grounds. So you do have riots even now. And these are challenges that we are still yet to fully overcome. Anyway, so the glass is only half full. How do we move from where we are today into making this transition, the economic, social, and political transition, complete? Well, there are several areas. We are still not very good, and I get actually impressed with the Australian government, be it at the federal level or different provinces. The capacity to make evidence-based policies is very good, and they are fully informed of what is happening around everywhere. So their capacity for policy making and implementation is that much more efficient and effective, which is a gap in our case. And we need to create systems for real-time monitoring and result assessment, so that whatever resources we are able to find and mobilize for development are effectively used. They don't leak away and line up the pockets of those who are corrupt. We also need a larger participation of public in our policy making process. Unless that happens, some of the marginalized segments of the population would not get integrated adequately with the mainstream, and that would come in the way of completing the transformations that we want to have. But specifically, we need to use more explicitly the principles of equity, efficiency, and sustainability. And we need scaffoldings like human rights to dismantle the vested interests in our society, which unfortunately are not being overcome by the existent political institutions in the country, because they also have their own vote bank politics. What is vote bank politics? Different politicians nurse different segments of the population with the hope that they would vote for them and then get them elected again. So this has further segmented the society rather than making it more. And we need decentralization of governance. But just to make things a little lighter, look at the cartoon there. This tells you equality of opportunity. Think of those boxes at the bottom on the left chart as support being provided by the state. So in the left panel, if I'm the state public official and somebody comes and asks me, are you doing the right thing? I'll say, yes, I'm doing the right thing. I'm giving exactly the same amount of support to the different segments of the population. But the fact is that allocation is not a very good one, because this segment of the population is missing out on all the fun which is happening across the fence. If the same amount of resources I was able to allocate like this, the outcome would be so much better. So these are the kind of normative considerations which need to influence our policy making process. Look at this one. I sit here in Delhi and I feel I'm a part of the federal government. I think of myself as a very wise person, and I say, okay, I know everything. I know what's happening in the ground. I know what I need to do. So here is a jacket which I have created. Everybody should get the same size and everybody should use it. But the fact is, the jacket is what should I use? It's a I'm looking for a word which has just gone off my head. Anyway, it's a program. So I'm sitting here, one size fit all program I've created in Delhi for everybody in the country to follow. But that jacket which I've created doesn't fit everybody. If I had created my policies in a more flexible manner, sitting here in Delhi with all my wisdom and all my experience that allowed flexibility at the ground level, then you could have an outcome such as this one. So I have kind of tailored his climb to the top and he's able to rise. In this case, I haven't done that tailoring. I haven't done that flexibility. I haven't been sensitive to the difference in the context. So this little fellow is finding it difficult to climb the hurdles that are there in the process of development. This is another cartoon which is very typical of India. Some parts of India, including the part where you are sitting right now. So there's this group going in this car and they're saying, oh, what is this lady? What does she do? And somebody tells, oh, no, she doesn't do anything. She's just a housewife. And look at what she's doing. She's fetching water. She's getting firewood to run and cook. She's looking after one kid here. There's another one in her lap. And our men folk are sitting like this and enjoying the sunshine in the winters. Now, these are attitudes in our society. So when you talk of policy correctives, you have to have policy correctives even to change this and change these rapidly. It's not, one could say, okay, with education these will change, but we want to do it faster. That's where scaffoldings like the human rights normative basis comes. So everybody is equal by law in practice, and then the attitudes start changing. And then you have role models. I mean, India is a land of contradictions. Actually, I should have started by that. While all this is also true about India, India was among the first countries in the world to make universal franchise. I mean, all women and men could vote, and this was in 1947. I spent some time in Switzerland, where this happened only in some mid-60s. We elected one of the first prime ministers, a woman prime minister, in a country where this is also the truth. So it's a land of contradictions, and it's so big that certain good things are happening in some parts and certain good things are happening in other parts. I'm going to just quickly go to the last. Okay, I want to mention 4 imperatives for our coming decades. What are these 4 imperatives? The first one is, we've got our macroeconomic reforms in place, But we now need to move from macroeconomic reforms to sector-specific reforms and move from center here in New Delhi to our provinces and states. So that's one thing we need to do. The second thing we need to do is, and we have failed so far, we have not generated enough non-farm employment opportunities. As a result, a large chunk of our population, nearly 40%, still survives on agriculture and rural areas. Why? Because our economy did not generate enough non-farm. So we need to move in that direction. The third thing is we are getting urbanized very quickly. And we haven't given enough attention to our urban facilities and urban towns. So that's another area of concern and policy correction that we need in the coming decades. Then there is this thing about the quality of our infrastructure, both physical and social. Roads, ports, airplanes, airports, electricity, but we also need better schools, better teachers, and so on and so forth. We need to still do a lot to integrate the marginal segments of our society with the mainstream to get rid of poverty, hunger, and malnutrition. But is there hope? Yes, there is a lot of hope. I feel I've done an econometric exercise and I forecasted that in 2050, which is when you people will be in the prime of your professional streams, India would be perhaps the largest economy in the world. Why do I say this? Despite all the poverty which you have seen already, and if not, you will see when you step out of the campus, despite all the inequities in opportunities and outcomes. Why do I say this? One of the things is this, and I'll just concentrate on this. There's two charts at the bottom. The left one is showing how our population is transiting. It's called the demographic transition. And the two ends of this diagram are 1950 and 2050. So the blue portion at the bottom is the proportion of children in our population, those below 14 years of age. The black at the top is the proportion of elderlies in the population, which is becoming larger as you are heading towards 2050. And the middle green band is the people who are in the working age. So what do you find? The working age population is ballooning. I have just represented these shares and converted them into what I call a dependency ratio. What is dependency ratio? You take the dependent population, part of your population, divided by the total population. Now, who are dependents in the population? The elderly and the young, because they're not part of the working stream. So what is happening to our dependency ratio is on the left side, it's going down. This is 2035. Dependency ratio will keep going down till 2035, which means the working age population is growing larger and larger. Now, if we make use of this transition well, how do we make use of it well? We create these livelihood opportunities, these non-farm livelihood opportunities. The moment we create livelihood opportunities in adequate numbers and absorb this ballooning working age population into productive jobs, what happens? Suddenly the country starts growing tremendously fast. It's already happening in India. It has started happening in India since 90s. Now, what is the dynamics there? Think of yourselves. Right now you're living on scholarships or support from your parents. Tomorrow when you join work, you'll feel rich for the first few months when the big packet comes. So you'll spend on buying new mobiles and whatever things you like these days. And then suddenly you will start wondering that there has to be some security for a rainy day. So you'll start saving quickly. When that happens, the national saving rates go up. When national saving rates go up, there is so much more money available in the country to push for investments into development, changing your economy. So that's what India is doing right now, and we are in this transition, but we have to get our policies right to absorb the expanding population workforce. Also, there are other few things that are happening. Our civil society has come of age. A lot of the entitlements I mentioned earlier, right to health, right to food, etc., they have come not because some perceptive political leadership. Of course, they were supported, but it has come from the civil society. They pushed the political leadership into creating these entitlements and creating a better option for the world. And I end with this. There are certain downsides also. We are in an environment, we are seeking to grow in an environment where the global economy is not very strong, and there are some certain other things. I'll just skip that. But I want to end on an optimistic note, and I want each one of you to look at this picture on the slide there. This is what is the generation in the pipeline. If you have a country which has a generation like in the pipeline, which will come into its own in 20, 25 years from now, then you can well imagine what the country can do. So there is hope for India, and I hope some of you, when you get your degrees, etc., you get excited about coming and working here. We are seeing a larger and larger proportion of foreigners coming and working in India, and I hope some of you come and contribute to our growth process, and also in the process learn and do something for yourself. So I stop here. I'm sorry it was rushed because you have this trip to Delhi, but I hope you enjoyed what I said. Not all lectures are enjoyable, I understand that. But if there are any quick questions, one or two I can take. You had one, yes.
What do you think are the most promising types of manufacturing exports that India will produce in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, that's kind of, we are doing a whole range of exports. You'd be surprised though, we don't have.
Specifically manufacturing.
Yeah, so we are doing a whole range of manufacturing exports, from light engineering products to automotives to now satellites, if you would like it, to oil products. We are short of oil, but now we are getting oil, crude oil, we're converting it into products, and it's a major part of our. So we are doing a whole range of them. But I expect, we need to be doing those manufacturing exports where gradually, not immediately over the next 10, 15 years, where the knowledge content, technology content is high. One of the areas where we do have a comparative advantage is in software right now. We are trying to build up our hardware capacities and capabilities also. But India, being such a huge country, has practically a foot in every bit of manufacturing. But we need to go into some of these high value-added manufacturing and high knowledge-intensive manufacturing products, which is where we are moving right now. So we are, as I said, we are making satellites, and our satellites are being also taken by the developed countries. It's not just for developing countries. So it's a land of contradiction. You'll find so many contradictions in our country that you just can't imagine how it still manages to hold it. So I would say, knowledge intensive, high technology.
Can you recommend any reading material on this subject of Indian manufacturing capacities?
Yes, I have given, there's this one pager which may have been circulated to you. If it hasn't been, I'll ask them to circulate it. I have given references one or two, which you might want to have a look at it. Anything else? I think you are tired. So have a good visit to Delhi, enjoy the sun. And be careful, if you step out of the buses, be careful. Thank you.